Hello everyone, welcome back to the Benchwarmers Podcast. Unfortunately this week my co-host Josh Sykes can't be joining me. He's got other occupancies to take care of. But I'm delighted to be joined by BBC sports journalist Ollie Bayliss. Ollie, how are you?
Hi mate, yeah, very well, thank you, and pleasure to be asked to sit in. How are you? You well?
Yes, I'm also good, thank you. So Ollie, from my understanding, you are of course a journalist for the BBC. How did you sort of get into that? So what point did you realise maybe you wanted to go into journalism?
Yeah, a little bit by luck, to be honest. No, I went to uni and studied history. Did history for 4 years at Nottingham, but did student radio when I was there, and loved that. I sort of got dragged along by my housemates, to be honest, with the idea that we might present a show in an evening for half an hour or so, and sort of got sucked into that. Really loved that. When I finished uni, having done sort of three and a half years of student radio, got really involved in that. I thought, well, I wonder if there's a way I can get involved in that, do that as a career. And I did what I recommend everyone does, really, is volunteer, knock on as many doors as possible, do as much work experience as you possibly can. Was a mascot for the local radio station in my town that doesn't exist sadly anymore, Mix 96, for a while. Used to wear the Mix Monster costume, smelled a bit like old Goldie gloves. Was pretty disgusting, but did that for 10 quid an hour. But it was getting involved in radio, sort of. And did bits and pieces for them, applied here, there and everywhere. Eventually did work experience at BBC Three Counties Radio, where I think I just stuck around a little bit too long and stopped going away, and eventually they gave me something useful to do, and 10 years on almost. 10 years on. Still here, now a journalist here, doing bits and pieces of sport, covering non-league, which I love, and setting up other programmes as well, doing news journalism also for that. It's fantastic. It's a career and a job I absolutely love.
How old was you when you actually applied for the work experience then?
I would have left uni after 4 years, so 23, I think, 22, 23, something like that. And that was back in the day when they did 4-week work experience placements, which I don't think they do anymore. A month was a long time to pester people for work and afterwards, and try and make yourself useful and make a lot of cups of tea. And if you make a cup of tea for the right person for long enough, eventually someone might just give you a shift, which is kind of what happened. And a bit right place, right time. A couple of people left, they need somebody to cover something, and you kind of just stick around. It's some of it is just making enough cups of tea and being nice and not stepping on too many toes, and a lot of it's just right place, right time, and being in front of somebody as they're thinking, I wonder who we can get in to do that. Unfortunately, it's a bit of luck with this industry, but I was lucky enough to get my foot in there.
So for advice for younger journalists then, would you recommend looking into work experience, even if it's unpaid or anything like that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a frustration that so often it is unpaid. And I think that is one of the biggest problems within the industry, because the industry as a whole, I think media, I think sport is often criticised for not being as widely diverse as it should be. And what's frustrating is that because so many of these placements are unpaid, the only sort of people who can afford to do it are people who are fortunate enough to be able to work for a month unpaid. And a lot of people, quite rightly, who can't afford to just do nothing and do work and not earn a penny for 4 weeks, 6 weeks, wherever these placements are. And that, unfortunately, is a big problem across the industry. It's getting better. I know the BBC now pays expenses, things like that. It's getting better, but that is still a bit of a problem. But if you can afford to, because I appreciate not everyone can afford to work unpaid for the time being, that is the way forward, really. It's get your foot in the door where you can, meet as many people as you can, make as many cups of tea as possible, and learn things. I did quite a lot of work experience in places that ultimately didn't end up working in, but you learn something everywhere you go. You learn how an office works, actually, how a professional work environment works. And you learn skills, radio skills, TV skills, broadcast skills, whatever it is you're interested in. You learn that at the same time as well. I think it's really useful.
Yeah, we talked about this briefly before we start recording, but you actually didn't take journalism at university. So do you feel like going into sort of a career of journalism, you perhaps don't need it as a degree?
I can only really talk from the point of view of where I am and in the BBC, and I work with people who have taken journalism and studied journalism, but I work with people who haven't as well. Certainly here, it's what you can do, and you pick up things as you go, and you learn things, and there are courses and things you can do on the job to learn the bits and pieces you need. I know people, I've got friends who work in commercial radio that are horrified that I'll write a news bulletin or do a news voice without having got a journalism qualification. That's not how it works elsewhere, but fortunately where I am, it's never really felt like something I needed once I was in the industry, but I know it is useful to work elsewhere, certainly.
So have you actually faced any setbacks in your career in journalism?
That's a good question. Yeah, I think stories and working on stories is always a tricky one. Sometimes you put a lot of work and time into something, and often, and you get a bit of a sense of it sometimes, but often what looks like a story or what looks like a situation isn't necessarily the truth of it. And the more work and more research you do into something, more often than not, you kind of realize the two sides to every argument, and actually the kind of sensational top line story you were looking at actually isn't necessarily the reality and the truth of it. And we at the BBC and elsewhere as well, lots of organisations hold themselves to quite high editorial standards, that they don't report something to be one-sided without offering a balance to an argument. And sometimes you can get to a point where you actually realise there isn't a story. There isn't really a story in this. This isn't really as interesting or what you thought it out to be. And that happens quite regularly, but that's part of most of the job, and that's why you look at things and you explore things in depth. Aside from that, though, I'm quite fortunate to have not really suffered any sort of major setbacks.
Of course, you work for a presenter on the Non-League Show on the BBC Three Counties Radio. How did you find it moving from a university radio to not to disrespect the Nottingham University radio station, but to a big one in the BBC? Actually,
not. I think the standard of student radio and community radio, actually, there's a lot of things. There's a lot of things that were almost more professional that we used to do, to be honest, in student radio than we do in the BBC sometimes. And that's not to do a disservice to the BBC, but actually we were. I mean, whether we were the exception or not, we worked really hard on things. And actually, I think that the level and the standard of what we used to do was really good. It was certainly good training and a good background for going on and doing things elsewhere. I think people who are dismissive of student radio or community radio, people that have not been involved in it or not worked in it or not presented in it, I think that the standard is really good, and it's a really good sort of benchmark, a really good learning place to develop and learn skills to take elsewhere. It's all remarkably similar. It's all favours in a microphone, really.
Heading into sort of the non-league show, then, was it always your intentions to get more involved with the non-league compared to maybe the EFL or Premier League?
Yeah, I've always been a non-league fan. I've always gone and watched my local non-league team, my local non-league teams. I love football. At that level of the pyramid, I just think there's really interesting characters, there's really interesting stories to be told. Yeah. And I sort of say I don't watch Match of the Day on a Saturday night, and I'm not interested in the EFL because I am as well. And, I love going to games at all levels, but I really like the idea of shining a bit more of a light on the non-league game and highlighting some of the things that go on, because there's some brilliant and quirky and fantastic people and some brilliant stories at that level. And it's full of people that do it for the love of it. There's not really any money for managers or for volunteers. That level of the game, a little bit for players, but not a huge amount. It's people who do it for the love of it, and they're more often than not really happy to share that with you. In fact, they always are. I've never had a club say, "Oh no, we don't want to talk to you." It's a great way. I'd recommend it to anyone actually. If you want to get involved in covering sport more, there's no point knocking on the door at Man United and asking for an interview, because you're not going to get one. If you go down to your local Isthmian League, Southern League, Premier League team, they're always going to give you the time of day because they're grateful for the coverage. And I think that it's a really good place to learn your craft, even if you're not madly passionate about non-league football. It's a really good place to begin covering sport, because there are so many people that commentate on games or do post-match interviews at non-league, and they do it for love of it, but it's also a great experience. Again, you can't really turn up at Old Trafford and say, "I want to do commentary." You can go on to most non-league clubs and say, "Can I do commentary? Can I, create a feed and put it online?" And most will be more than happy to have that sort of coverage and that sort of exposure.
Yeah. So obviously you have to be unbiased on your radio show, but is there a certain non-league side that maybe you've come to like over the past few years of you doing the show?
I mean, I grew up in Aylesbury, so Aylesbury United was the non-league team I used to go and watch when I was younger, first and foremost, and still the kind of first result I look for, still the team I try and see a good few times a season. I'm quite lucky that we've got a massive patches. We cover Beds, Hearts and Bucks, and I think I'm right in saying we've got about 10% of the country's non-league teams in this patch. So basically, it means I can just split loyalties. You know, we've got an FA Trophy, FA Cup, FA Vars run, or a club that's doing really well in those competitions. You know, I can jump on that bandwagon. It's great. And then there'll be someone else in a different cup that's doing really well. I can jump on that bandwagon. It's great from that point of view. It's you've sort of got many eggs in many baskets, covering all our local non-league teams, and there's loads of really good ones with really good history.
Continuing on with your BBC Three Counties radio show there, I realise I probably shouldn't name the entire radio show every time I talk about it, but is there anyone that you've interviewed in the past who have had a really, like a character you wouldn't expect them to sort of have, if that makes sense?
Oh, that's a good question. I've interviewed loads of really interesting people. Some of the most interesting people are people that are just fans and really love the lower league game. Recently I spoke to astrologer Russell Grant, who is famous for his work on TV and you know, talking about star signs and things like that. But I don't think many people realise he's absolutely crazy about local non-league football. He runs a Facebook group all about non-league clubs in the Middlesex area with sort of, you know, 400, 500 people who exchange like old programmes and things like that. And that was absolutely fascinating to speak to somebody who's sort of not known for being really into his non-league football, but is like crazy passionate about it. So like Alex Horn from Taskmaster on now Channel 4, a big Cheshire United fan. Whenever you watch the show, quite often they have like a challenge filmed in a local football ground. It's always, you know, looks a little bit muddy, a little bit rustic. That's Cheshire United that he always uses. So yeah, I'm kind of fascinated by them actually. People who are really into non-league that you wouldn't necessarily expect.
Yeah, like celebrities who maybe you wouldn't think would support a non-league club.
Yeah, exactly that. And there's quite a few of them up and down the country. And
are there any players?
They're always very interesting.
Are there any players you've ever interviewed who you thought, like, I don't know, presented themselves really well on a radio show?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, quite a few. I think what's great about non-league football is they don't go through the kind of hours and hours of media training. I mean, it's in a really nice way that Premier League and to an extent professional players will have. You know, if you play for a Premier League team, you know, they have a couple of days in the summer where you get a bit of media training and you're taught how to represent the club in the best way. And sometimes that then leads to quite formulaic post-match interviews, doesn't it? We've all seen it on telly where a player will, you know, praise the opponent, or they'll say it was a tough match, they'll say it was a group effort and everyone's come together. And, you know, you don't really get that in non-league. People just say what they think. And that's part of what I love about it as well. Managers, chairman, there isn't the same sort of caution about saying anything too outrageous in non-league. You know, even people that run leagues are quite happy to say what they think about the FA, or you don't get that sort of censorship that you get, I think, higher up the pyramid. So yeah, loads of players. Players are always really interesting to talk to. It's always really interesting as well to find out what they do for the rest of the day. I know some people get a bit funny actually about, you know, the FA Cup Marine, for example, recently, and I know a lot of people are quite frustrated that the media focus in on what these players do as a day job, and, you know, so and so at left back as a postman, things like that. And I can totally see that to a point, because why, you know, treat them in the afternoon like football players. But actually, sometimes what they do for a living is really interesting and really fascinating. Especially, you know, if you look at players that have to sort of give up or adapt what they do to play in non-league. You know, loads of them are secondary school teachers. And for me, you know, if you're playing, I don't know, away 4 miles or 4 hours away or whatever, like, how on earth they get time off work or able to leave work at a certain time to go and travel away for a, you know, 7 p.m. kickoff is crazy. So actually, the people that kind of have to adapt the two are always quite interesting, I find.
Yeah, I've interviewed Penistone Church manager and his assistant manager before, because he was actually a teacher at my school, was the assistant manager. And you find that for some reason, even the first team coach of that club was also a teacher. It's like a running trend that teachers not have to, but they're working non-league football alongside it. It's a bit strange.
I think
but
quite often they're really good communicators as well. Actually, there's probably a lot of skills where if you're teaching and speaking in front of a group of teenagers, actually that's quite similar, if we're honest, to most football dressing rooms, isn't it? It's the same ability to deliver a clear message and to even plan training in a structured way. I bet it's really quite similar. But can you imagine, you can't do a parent-teacher evening because he's got a away match in the FA Vase. It must be difficult to kind of juggle the two quite often for them.
Yeah. So obviously you've got a lot of opportunities from doing the non-league show, such as football commentating. And I managed to find online that your first ever game was a commentary between Lincoln City and versus Boreham Wood. I now know where I've got that from because you asked me before. It's from Sports by Sunderland. You must have been interviewed by them.
Okay, I mean that is an incredible piece of research from you. I'm not sure I would remember that, but wow, I'm impressed.
What was your thoughts on commentating on that game?
It's really, commentary full stop is really difficult. It's not something I claim to be amazing at. It's very much still learning. It's really fun. It's the closest that the people like me who are not brilliant, natural, talented footballers that can play a bit of five-a-side, but beyond that, not very good. It's close as you kind of get to feeling really involved in a game of football. When you go to a game and watch it as a fan, you don't quite get the same. You don't quite get as sucked in, I think, as when you do commentary and you are literally trying to work out who every player on the football pitch is, which is never easy, especially in non-league where they don't always have squad numbers and player names on the back of the shirt, and they move around an awful lot. It won't be news to anyone, but do you know what I mean? It's a player in a position where you expect a left back to be isn't always a left back, and you do quickly learn that commentary. But it's brilliant fun. It's really fun. I love describing football and talking about football. And it's really, at the moment, it's an absolute privilege because at the moment there are so many thousands of people, if not millions of people, who want to go and watch live football. So to be able to do that, still to be able to go into the stadium and do that, it does at the moment especially feel like a real privilege.
How do you actually decide what game you're going to go watch? Do the BBC tell you, or do you look at the list of fixtures and decide from that?
Yeah, more or less the boss is here. We cover Beds, Hearts and Bucks here, so we cover Watford, Stevenage, MK Dons, Luton, Wickham, and then Boreham Wood and Oldham, Hemel, go down the pyramid. There's been a few occasions where there'll be FA Trophy round, something like that. And I'll pick a game, FA Vase game, pick a game to go and do a report from. But mostly it's dividing us up and making sure that we've got games covered. But because of that, you get to see, or I'm certainly lucky enough to get to see lots of different clubs and go around the country and see lots of grounds, gradually ticking off the 92 as well as I go.
Yeah. In terms of I'm not too sure. I haven't actually listened to any of your commentaries in a football game before. Do you have the same co-commentator for every game, or is it different who you're playing or who you're watching?
It totally varies on the game and who's available. Lots of them are ex-players, which is always really interesting.
Okay.
Definitely as a commentator who obviously I've not played the game at any high level, it's really interesting to have somebody alongside you who can talk about the game and offer a different insight. And something that Talk Sport 5 like, something that they'll do all the time, and games on TV as well, because there's an injury or the ball goes dead for a bit or nothing's happening. Rather than describing every kick and every moment in that way, to have somebody next to you who can bring a bit of insight or talk about I don't know, it's an early August game where it's really hot and you can just talk to them about the impacts of the weather and whether really as a player you notice that heat or something like that. There's always ways you can bring their knowledge out and listen to them. And being a co-commentator, being a summariser is a really difficult skill. I think sometimes it's more difficult than commentating, because commentator you can just describe what's happening. As a summariser, you have to say something interesting every time, and quite often there's nothing interesting that's happening. You have to add something apart, beyond what is just describing the literal and obvious thing that's happening in front of you. And that can be a challenge. You also need to know how long you've got to talk. If someone's had a chance and goal on the shot, you might have 3 seconds to quickly say something about that, because the ball is then going up the other end and your commentator needs to take over again to describe what's happening. And the the worst relationship between commentators and summarisers is when a commentator has to interrupt or stop a summariser because they need to describe quickly what's about to happen because it might lead to a goal. Whereas the ball goes dead, nothing's happening, and the commentator's trying to have a swig of coffee, and the summariser says 2 words and hands back again. It's equally, they need to judge how long they've got to talk, and that's a difficult skill as well.
Yeah. I was also fascinated to see that you're actually a researcher for Football Manager. How did that opportunity come about?
I mean, I've always been a massive fan of the games. I think the games are brilliant. I think
it's a great game. I play it every day. I'll play it 10 minutes before we start this call.
It's fantastic, isn't it? The level of depth and reality to it is really good. And I think it was like 10, 12 years ago. I was sort of scanning the old SI forums and I spotted a post about, we need some researchers to do these clubs and non-league and lower leagues. Of course, it's non-league. Everything. My life is non-league. So I jumped at the chance. It's not a paid role or anything. The best thing that happens is they use your name as one of the new gen names. So when you play a series, obviously, and then the academy kids come through that aren't real players, there'll occasionally be an Ollie Bayliss that pops up. It's normally Scunthorpe United. I'm normally 1-star ability and get released after 2 seasons. But I occasionally pop up in places and games. And sometimes people have sent me little screenshots of the various Ollie Baylisses and all their games that are equally underwhelming and lacking in talent. But I like that. That's the best thing about it. Yeah,
it's a good touch. Is there a certain team that you always take charge of in Football Manager to start off with?
I totally vary. I sort of swing from one game to the next. So last year's game, I did unemployed, sort of lots of leagues in Europe, and just sort of hopped around like Sweden and trying to do well there.
Yeah.
This season, Hemel Town at the moment, who are probably the closest manageable team without downloading sort of add-ons and extra leagues to where I live, and a team in second tier non-league football, which is always quite fun to manage in. I'm better as a manager in non-league football. As soon as I get up to sort of a decent level, I've got a lot of staff and a lot of players. I struggle with it. I'm quite good at managing fairly poor players that you can sign on a free and want to leave you after a season if they do well. Hemel Town this season.
Okay. So how do you actually decide what player deserves what stats? So, for example, if you're watching a player and you look at his pace, how do you decide where he goes, if that makes sense?
Yeah, there's various guidelines of your sort of thresholds and what an average player for a certain league would be this level of ability, and then you've got some flexibility within that. But the game are very keen to make sure that you don't have a player playing for Hemel Town that is actually better than Lionel Messi or has got 23 stats.
Yeah,
it's not realistic, because if they're doing that on that level, they'd be playing at a higher level. Of course, there's good players at levels where they're playing, beneath themselves. So you kind of got thresholds and things like that, and you can dish out certain attributes in one place, but then you sort of need to compensate them somewhere else. Otherwise, you're making a player that's too good. So there's certain sort of current ability and potential ability thresholds that you can tweak a little bit. But if you do it too much, then the people that oversee it will say no and take it out again. So part of it is that. Part of it is looking at putting in last season stats, all those things that make the game brilliant. All the player history that you can look at players' career and tell you all the clubs they played for. All those bits need logging and putting in. There's a few hidden attributes as well: personalities, professionalism, determination. All the bits that make up the bit. If you go to a player's information and it says personality, there's a few hidden things under the bonnet there that make up those. And there's sort of personal traits as well. Like to play from the back or those bits and pieces. But it's just a judgment thing. It's judge. The more you see of a player, the more you get an idea as to what they're good at, what they're not. I've had a few players message me and say, "Oh, can you sort that out?" Or I'm down as a attacking midfielder. I've never played there in my life. Things like that as well. But generally, the game is really accurate. Most accurate football game you can get in terms of
it's incredible.
Players and getting it as right as possible.
Yeah. So sort of moving on from Football Manager then. Obviously, I saw before we started this podcast on your Twitter, Project Non-League, which from my understanding is basically where clubs are proposing that some teams are promoted using points per game from the last 2 seasons' results in order to fill the gaps in the restructured pyramid. This is literally from your tweet, by the way. So, and this proposal would see no clubs relegated. So, can you just talk us a bit more through that?
Yes, at the moment, people that don't know, non-league, so non-elite to non-league. So the National League is still carrying on, but everything below that at the moment is on pause. And looking at the national picture, things aren't likely to change in the next month, 2 months. So the season is at the moment stopped with about a quarter of the games played. So the big problem that they're trying to solve at the moment is, what do we do with that? This time last year or last March, when the pandemic started, they were about 75% of the way through the season and made the decision to null and void it, get rid of all the results and start the season again afresh, basically. That's what they've done. We've got 25% of the way through. This has happened again. So now trying to work out what to do. This season, which is a bit different to last season, they're asking clubs their thoughts. So they're sending out a survey. They've done that today to clubs to see what they think, what their opinions are, and then hopefully that will inform what happens next. The challenge that is going to be is what do you do with the season that's 25% played, because it's too early to talk about points per game. Really, it's not really. Some teams have only played 3 or 4 games. It's too early to relegate a team based on 3 or 4 games you played when you're expecting to play a season. Similarly, probably too early to promote teams. I think the options on the table are that they either again make it null and void and scrap it, or they roll into next season, maybe pick up where we left off next August and carry on from there. Or there's a group of clubs, and they're calling it Project Non-League, that want to roll last season's results into this season and come up with a point per game table based on the last 2 seasons, basically, that haven't been able to finish. That's their suggestion. There's obviously some clubs that are very supportive of that, mostly those that will get promoted because of that suggestion. But you can understand that, it's what happened in the Premier League and the EFL as well, didn't it, last summer, where clubs that, were going to get promoted automatically wanted to get promoted automatically on points per game. Clubs like Peterborough that were going to miss out on the playoffs narrowly proposed that maybe we should expand the playoffs to 8 teams because, surprise, it involved them. Clubs that were going to get relegated wanted to scrap it all and not. Clubs are always going to vote for what benefits them. You can't really blame them for doing that. So that's now what's happening again in non-league. I think it's frustrating from the outside looking in. It's frustrating that we don't really have a rule in place or anything in place to decide what was going to happen if this were to happen. Because I think we probably could have predicted it might happen. We didn't know in August we weren't going to get this far into the season, but it was a possibility. So the fact here we are again trying to make this decision is a little bit frustrating and disappointing, I think.
So for a team like South Shields, for example, who I think last season were top by quite a margin, look set for promotion and probably replace Breath Park Avenue in National League North. Would it be like their points from last season get added on to their points from this season and it goes on from like that?
Yeah, exactly that is that proposal. So you add together both lots of points and then you divide it by the number of games they've played to sort of even it out amongst different teams that obviously played less or more games. And to go with that, I think legally that can be quite difficult because the decision was made and then South Shields then took legal action against the FA on that decision that I think cost them about £250,000, they said. And the South Shields were ordered to pay the FA's costs because it went to court. So the FA were to undo that and to then decide to use last season's results. I think legally whether they are able to do that leaves them open to a challenge in South Shields to say, well, hang on a minute, you can pay our costs then if ultimately you've overturned your decision. Legally, it might become a little bit tricky. But that's certainly a solution that I think clubs like South Shields have done really well at proposing.
I've also seen online briefly, I don't really know too much about it, but it was on Breath Park Avenue's Twitter that some teams are asking the government for actual money instead of just loans. How would this work in making it fair towards other teams in like deciding how much each team gets?
The National League South have started the season obviously without fans when they started the season. They've carried on because they're elite sport or in that elite sport bracket. They've carried on playing. They're not getting fans in, so they're having to pay players but without any income. At the start of the season, the league and the government managed to arrange a £10 million grant payment from the National Lottery to take them through till Christmas. There was an awful lot of toing and froing over how that was divided up between teams. A lot of teams complained. The National League chairman resigned in part because of that, possibly. We're not sure, but left his post. There was a whole separate committee set up to look at it. The long and short answer is that that money has now run out. The next pot of money is hopefully going to come from the government, but it isn't clear whether that's going to be a loan, whether that's going to be in free money as a grant. And the challenge is going to be how they divide it up, whether they divide it up in the same way as how they divided up the last lot of money that ended in lots of rows, or whether they come with a new solution, new way of dividing it up, in which case there'll be clubs that will get less this time than they got last time, and then it will inevitably end up in a row again. One way or another, it's going to unfortunately end up with clubs unhappy. I think one of the big challenges about the moment for the National League is over testing, because they're carrying on playing, but there isn't any testing for the National League. And if you look at the national picture and what's going on, and the EFL have started testing, whether they can get away with and carry on playing without any sort of COVID testing is a big question mark. And that also is tied in with money, because the reason they're not doing it is clubs can't afford it, basically. So that's the situation that clubs like Rugby Park Avenue are in. It's a tricky situation at the moment in the National League. It's not totally clear what's going to happen going forward.
I don't really have anything else to add on Project Non-League. So I'll get a few of your thoughts then, just in terms of a few things that have happened recently in the National League. For example, today, at the time of recording, on the 15th of January, Boreham Wood manager Luke Garrard has been given a new 3-year contract extension. Do you feel like this is good news for Boreham Wood fans? Yeah,
massively. He is one of the longest serving managers already, actually, in non-league and in English football. He's only 35. He took over, I think he was 30, 31. Really good, young, talented manager. Enthusiastic. He's someone that I've had the pleasure of interviewing lots of times. He really knows his stuff, really knows the game at that level, played the game at that level, played for the club before becoming player manager. Really good, talented manager. And I think a bit of stability doesn't hurt, does it? Having somebody that knows what they're doing, knows the sort of players they want to bring in, and backing them. Season before last, they finished one place off bottom, and the club, to their credit, stuck with him and backed him. And I think, the fact they got to the playoffs the season after is credit to that.
Yeah.
I think you don't always get anywhere by chopping and changing, because new manager comes in and they get rid of half the squad that you've paid a fortune for to bring in their own players. That manager doesn't last 4 months, and a new manager comes in, gets rid of the squad again. It can be a very costly way of running a football club. So credit to Boreham Wood for sticking with him. And I think he's probably managed to destined for the Football League at some point, whether it be with Boreham Wood or elsewhere. He's a good young talented manager.
I'm not too sure if it was you that tweeted out or another non-league journalist that I follow, but I saw that there's a possible chance that Bury FC could be reinstated into either the National League North or the National League. Do you have any thoughts on this matter in terms of what would mean for Bury AFC, the new Phoenix club that was created, or would it even be allowed to be brought back in that higher level?
They considered it last summer. So it's Steve Dale, isn't it, the owner of the owner of Bury, and he put in an application. We know that much, but the league considered it, but then threw it out last summer. It's a really difficult one if you're a Bury fan, whether you go and follow or continue to follow the new AFC team, or whether you go back to the old team. And I imagine they would be split between wanting a club that is more organic and more fan-led in AFC Bury, or whether they would want to return as soon as possible to Bury FC and at a slightly higher level. It's a tricky one, but I think the FA will probably be reluctant to allow them to enter back at that level without a good case being put forward and a good financial case being put forward. I think they probably want to see a lot of documentation and paperwork and assurances before that's allowed to happen.
Yeah. It's not the final question then. Is there one team that you've seen this season, or that you've heard good things about this team, that you've been impressed with?
There's quite a few lower down that unfortunately we're now at a point where the season stops and not being able to carry on. I think hashtag United are always a really interesting one, actually. A team that they meet a little bit of reluctance, I guess, from the sort of older non-league community, but I think they're a force for good. I think they're a club that are encouraging lots of younger people to be interested in non-league football. I think that can only be a good thing. I think when they originally joined the pyramid 2.5 seasons ago, people were saying, well, you can put on an exhibition match at Wembley, but you're not going to manage it in the sort of Tuesday, Saturday routine of non-league on muddy pitches, and credits that they absolutely have. I think they're one of the victims of what this null and void decision, if it goes that way, because I think they probably deserve promotion up to Step 4 based on what they've done over the last 2 seasons. I think they're a really interesting team. We've barely got started in the league is one of the challenges. You know, credit to teams like Marine, who have done really well, and Chorley as well, doing really well in the FA Cup. I think both of those deserve a lot of credit. But it's just frustrating. We've barely got going in most of non-league, to be honest, this season.
Well, that's going to bring an end to this week's episode of the Benchwarmers Podcast. I hope you all enjoyed. As usual, I'd like to thank my guest this week, Ollie Bayliss.
My pleasure. Thank you. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah, me too. Thank you very much. And we'll see you all next week.